I'm Ben Johnson. I'm really excited, really happy to be here with you guys. I drove up all the way from Whittier. I normally work down in Irvine, so super stoked to be kind of meeting new people in the greater Los Angeles area. Normally for me, the greater Los Angeles area means the south side of LA rather than the northern side of LA. But tonight we're going to be talking about testing and specifically testing React apps and ways that we can increase our confidence in the code that we push out to production. So if you're looking to follow me on Twitter or tweet about tonight or anything like that, I am on Twitter at BenjaminJ, that's 2 M's. Back when I was in whatever, like 9th grade, I was planning on going into music, and so the Jammin is a hearkening back to my music days. And then, like Dave said, you can find JavaScript LA stuff on the hashtag JavaScript LA. That's across Instagram, Twitter, as well as joining us on Discord. Tonight we're not going to be doing like just a full-blown slide deck. We're mostly going to be kind of getting our hands dirty in the code, and we're going to be looking at kind of what does it look like to have an app that maybe has 0 tests, and what does it look like to start wading into the waters of automating that app. I know for myself, many of the apps that I've stepped into in my short career so far, but many of the apps I've stepped into have been completely untested from the time I started, and we've had to add automation along the way, right? So, and this can be for a number of reasons, right? And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these reasons. Perhaps didn't have enough time to write tests, we need to ship now because we need to be first to market, or maybe the business didn't quite value automated testing completely. Perhaps we just don't know where to start, and that's all of those are okay reasons. But what we're here tonight to talk about is like how can we get started, right, with adding tests to a code base that maybe has only been manually tested before. So if you want to follow along, if you've got, I see some of you have your computers, some of you don't, totally fine if you don't have your computers, but if you want to follow along, I do have the source code or the link for this, so I'm going to drop these in the Discord really quick. So copy link address, and I'm going to drop it in Meetup tonight, okay? So you can find all of the slides and the demo app up on that link. And if you want to follow along in a code sandbox, I've created a code sandbox that is a mirror of, oh crap, sorry. Uh-oh. Okay, I haven't created a code sandbox, never mind. But if you want, here, let's grab this link though for the actual GitHub repo. Sorry. View. Show, sorry. One sec. Let's grab the GitHub link. So if you do want to follow along on the repo or look at the source code, there is the link to the source code, and the README does have installation instructions. So without any further ado, I do want to pop open the demo app. So I built a demo app to simulate kind of us having an app that has 0 tests. It's not a incredibly complex app because we're only here for one night and we're only here for 30 minutes, 40 minutes or so. So I didn't want to make something that was truly like demoralizing for us to step into and feel like, oh my gosh, this has 0 test coverage, and I feel the weight of how long it would take me to manually test. This is a simple GitHub search app. So inside the, we have a topic that's a label, and that pops us open into a text input that we could type something in. We could type React or Review, whatever. And when we click search, this goes and hits GitHub's backend API and returns a list of matching repos. And then for each repo, we have this like see more, see less that just kind of expands some extra information. And then when we click see less, it hides that extra information. So that's the app we're going to be working with tonight. We're largely just going to kind of be looking at if you had an app like this. Many of us work on apps that hit a backend, render some components, deal with some user input. How would you even start on testing? Not how would we test the entire thing, but how would we get started? How would we convince our business that this is actually something worthwhile and something that we can actually pull off? So let's take a quick look at the code. So the code for this app is largely within 2 components. How's the font size for people? Is that large enough, small enough, the people in the back? That's good? Cool. So the source code for this component is largely based in just 2 components. There's a search component, and this does a couple things. It just holds the topic that was, if we look right here, the topic is this portion, right? So it holds the user input and state, and then it holds a list of repositories. That's all of these repositories after they've been fetched from the backend. If we look inside of the render function, we'll see just a couple of things, right? We'll see that form, right? So we see the form with the label. If you're not using labels on your forms for inputs, I'd highly encourage you to do so. It really helps for accessibility and for people maybe that aren't using the web as point-and-click users. So people that are using screen readers, blind users, having labels on your inputs is really, really helpful. So, and then we see the input, right? And that takes that topic value out of state and assigns it to the value. And then it has an updater function and a submit function on this form, right? And if we look at those 2 functions, like we can see that it does some stuff, right? That updater function right here just kind of takes the value, sets it into state. And our submit function, once we've actually submitted the form, it's an async function because it's calling the API, and it fetches, it calls this fetch repos function, which under the hood essentially calls the API and just does a little bit of formatting to the data so that it kind of fits the way that we want it to look. And once we fetch the repos, we set them into state. So that's the bulk of our kind of user input form that we're dealing with. Let's take a quick look at just kind of that list of repos that we rendered, right? So in this list of repos, you can see we basically just take them once they're more than an empty array, we just map them to a list of this repo component. So the second component that this app uses is a repo component, and it doesn't do much either, but it's it's much simpler than our app or our search component. Sorry. It also holds a little bit of state, is open, false, and that's the state of whether this see more, see less is open or closed, right? And then we just render our data. We render the repo's name, the repo's description, and the name is a link to the repository. And then we have a little bit of conditional rendering, right? So we say, is this open? Is it closed? If it's open, we want to render that extra content. If it's not open, don't render it. And then the last thing in our code base is the actual button to toggle open and close, right? So if it opens, we're going to call close function up here. And if it's closed, we're going to switch it to open. So that's kind of the code base that we're dealing with. This is a smaller code base because we're only here for one night. Chances are if you're stepping into a code base that was untested or you're getting started with testing and you're building a real world project, your code base is going to be a lot bigger than 2 files. And it's probably going to be a lot more use cases than 1 page, right? For us to start over, oh crap. For us to click, type in React, press search, wait for the API to resolve, look at the repos, press see more, see less. Doesn't take that super long, right? I'm running off a mobile hotspot right now, so that call does take a little bit of time. But all in all, we can do everything that this site does in, 30, 40 seconds. However, as your apps grow, it's no longer 30, 40 seconds. It takes you 30 minutes to do everything you can do in your site. Or as your site gets bigger and bigger, it can become 2 or 3 days. I know at a company that I've been working at recently, it's taken manual testers. For them to manually test all their use cases, it could be 2 days, which is a big case for automation in that with automated testing, we can run most of those manual test cases in a matter of 30 minutes. And that's thousands of tests, so we can actually test all of the edge cases, all of the weird inputs, all of very weird data states that our app could handle. So that's kind of the big case that we're making. But the question is, where do you start, right? Like like we know that it saves us time, but if we don't know where to start in our code base, we're just going to kind of hold that in the back of our head as, oh yeah, I should be testing, but I don't have time, and like for me to learn how to test or for me to start testing in this code base is going to take a lot more time than I currently have. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to start with the simplest component, and we're going to test that tonight. So I find it really helpful in a code base without tests to jump in and go after like the simplest thing that you can possibly test. You get a quick win, you get something tested, and having something tested is better than having nothing tested. And so what we're going to do is we're going to test this repo component tonight because it doesn't have as much state. It's something that we can easily kind of go after and say, what is this supposed to do? And how can we automate that? So I'm going to create a new file. We're going to do this inside an _ tests folder in the same folder as the repo. This is just one way to organize your tests. I guess for reference, how many people attended Marco's talk on intro to unit testing? Was anyone at his talk? Okay, I think that must have been at some of the other JavaScript LA locations. He did a great talk as an intro to unit testing, but we're not going to be able to lean on his context tonight, which is totally fine. But so we're going to create a _ tests folder, and we're just going to call this repo.test.js. So I like to organize my tests in the same repository as or in the same folder as my components, just because it helps me like keep the context of what I'm working with kind of small, right? So I know that all the files that I'm testing are right there next to my actual test files. So now we've got our repo.test.js file. We're going to do a couple things. So first, we're going to import a couple things. Right? We're going to import React. We are testing a React component, so we do need React in scope in this case. And we're going to import the actual component itself, right? Since we're testing that component, we do need it in scope as well. And then now we've got a couple things imported, what we're going to do is we're going to create what we call a describe statement. So this is just a way to group your test together. Sorry, one sec. We're using Jest tonight, and sorry, that's my bad for skipping that. But this is all using the Jest library. So if you're familiar with something like Mocha or Jasmine or Chai for assertions, Jest is a testing library that kind of wraps around a few other very popular testing libraries to give them an API that's really useful for testing front-end apps. So one of the things in Jest is called the describe statement. And this is a great way for us to group our tests. It kind of just describes a grouping of other tests. And the first argument is just a description of that grouping. So if you wanted to say, repo tests or repo component, you could do whatever you want here. I like to just wrap the name of my component in brackets. I find it looks really nice in the test runner, and it's pretty easy enough for me to follow. And then inside of here, we're going to write all of our individual tests. So if you're coming from Mocha land, you might be familiar with an it statement, and then you would say like it should do something, right? Another equivalent statement in Jest is test, and you can do it or test, all up to you, all up to your preference. So now we've kind of got our test at least set up. Now let's start like thinking about what we should test. So I think it's helpful when we're starting testing or just starting for the first time testing into a component to take one moment before we start just going, guns blazing, like flame coming off the keyboard, writing our tests, to take one moment to actually think, what is this supposed to do? So let's go back and think of our manual test cases. So what we're testing is this repo right here, right? This single card. And what is it supposed to do? Well, it's supposed to render, first off. React does that automatically for us. So we know it has to render. If it doesn't render, it's broken. But two, it has to render with the content. So if we pass in the name of the repository and the description, it does have to render with both of those. So that's kind of our first two cases. It's got to render, and it's got to render with content. But secondly, our second interaction that we're that we're calling out is this see more, see less. So that gives us two more cases, right? When I click on see more, I see extra content. When I click on see less, I hide extra content. So if we just went and wrote those few cases into our test file and went and filled out those tests, we've already saved ourselves quite a bit of time in manual testing, given that this test will probably run in a matter of milliseconds rather than a matter of seconds for us to manually test. So let's do our first test. We're just going to call renders with content, something like that, right? Or maybe initial content. How about that? Renders with the initial content. That's just the test that it renders. And then I'm just going to copy paste this twice because we have two other cases. And so the second case is we could say it renders the extra content after expanding, something like that, or maybe after clicking see more, right? So that's the after we click see more that we see these extra two pieces. And then thirdly, we're just going to say hides extra content after clicking see less. So we've created three very, very human test cases that are very similar to the way that we'd manually test our component. And this gives us a much more straightforward framework for getting started testing the component, because we can think of it exactly as if we were manually testing. We can think of it exactly the way a user is going to use our component, except that we're telling a computer how to do it. So where do we start? So I like to, if I don't know where to start, just write out the steps, whether you're solving a hard problem, you're working on an algorithm, or writing a test. I really like to just write out step by step if I don't know where to start. And so we're just going to do exactly that. We're going to write out all the things that we would do manually or that React would do automatically under the hood. And then we're going to go write a little code under each step to do those things. So first, render the component, right? This is going to happen at some point. For us to interact with it, we've got to render it. The second, basically, we're just going to check. So in this case, right, it renders, and we just want to check that this content's here and this content's here. Let's put both of those in. That the repo name is there, or what? Where is it, right? It's in the document. It's in the DOM, right? So it exists in the web page somewhere. And if we're only rendering this component, it exists in whatever this component spits onto the web page. So I'm going to say in the DOM. And then we're going to copy paste that guy because we're also checking that the repo description is there. So those are kind of our three steps to writing our first test with our React component. So the question then becomes, how do we render our component, right? And there's a few schools of thought with this. There's a lot of libraries to help with this. One of the most popular is a library called Enzyme. So if you're familiar with, if you've ever heard that term, it's a library called Enzyme that helps with, has a few different levels of rendering. There's another really a newer library that focuses on pushing us into really good testing patterns that I'm a big fan of, and it's called React Testing Library. And that's what we're going to be using tonight. So React Testing Library ships with a lot of nifty utilities just for interacting with our components the same way that a user would interact with our components. So we're going to import a function called render from React Testing Library. And if you're interested about learning all these, I posted the GitHub repo, and there's links to all of them down at the bottom. So if you're interested in learning these libraries, they all have awesome docs, and there's tons of tutorials out there. So if any of these kind of catches your eye and you're like, oh, I want to learn more on that, like go check out the GitHub repo. It's all down at the bottom. So this render function is just going to render our component into the DOM. So we're going to pass our component in. So render our repo. And our repo, if we look closely, actually requires us to pass some props into it, right? So we render it like this, if we render it like this, it's not going to show anything because we're not passing any data into that component. So we do need to make some props. So I'm just going to do this, const props equals, and I copy pasted those from the other file just for making things a little faster. And this is kind of our mock data for the component. So we can put whatever we want here. I like to just, if I'm in a hurry, I like to just put test or like test and then something else in every single field, but you could do whatever you want. You could do pop song references, you could do literary characters, you could do your coworkers, all up to you, all up to your mood. So we could just do, https:/github.com/testing workshop, something like that. And then we could put JavaScript Ninja right here. And then for our description, for our description, we say something like learn testing. And then these extra 2 keys are the things that show up in the extra content, right? So let's say like just it has 1,000 stars, and let's say it has a MIT license. Once again, you could put whatever you want. You could put test, you could put like an emoji if you want. You could do whatever you want here. We're just going to do MIT license, 1,000 stars. And we're going to pass our props into our component. So the reason that I like to put the props up above the describe statement, personally, is that it helps me in reusing them. You'll find that if you're doing these tests on these components, that you'll end up typing out the same props over and over and over and over and over again. And a lot of times each test may only change 1 prop, or maybe 2. And so just typing them up here lets us just kind of copy it into the component over and over, and then we can override, if we wanted to change the number of stars, we can say stars equals 500, and that will override our default props. So we've rendered our component, but what does this render function return? So once again, with React Testing Library, its driving force is helping us write our unit tests, write our component tests in a way that is close to the way that we would interact with the component. So all of the helpers put out by render actually mostly feel very similar to the way that we would select things as a user. So something like get by text simulates the idea that I see the text on the page, and then it'll fetch that DOM node for me. A lot of people will try to grab things by like a class name or a ID or maybe the component name in a lot of testing frameworks. And while this works, I find that if you grab things by their text, you grab things the same way that we would use them as a user, our tests end up to be a little bit more resilient and a little bit closer to the way that we would manually test, a little bit closer to the way that it works in real life. So, and then in that get by text, we can essentially just start running our, we can essentially start running our assertions. So get by text, and we can just pass in our repo name. And then what do we care about that this thing is? We care that's in the DOM, right? And so for testing React, I have actually added a couple extra things. One nifty thing about Jest is that it lets you add a whole bunch of extra matchers to expect, so that you can run these extra assertions, right? So if you're testing against UI, if you're testing UI components, well, you need these extra things to grab things out of the DOM. You want to check that it's in the DOM. And this file is here. If you want to go look at the source, like go check out the GitHub repo. It's all up there. You can see why it's there. But it does add these extra matchers, something like this, to be in the document. So this reads almost exactly the same as this, right? We expect that this node is in the document. And if we go over to our tests and we start getting up and running, we'll notice that it passes, which is cool. And if we change it, right, that content doesn't exist in the document because we rendered something different, and we'll see a big failing test, and it'll actually tell us what is actually there. So if you're trying to fix your test, sometimes this can be helpful in debugging. So, and then we could do the exact same thing for the description, right? So I'm just going to copy paste that guy. And so our description was learn testing. And There we go. So that test assertion, that's the first one, right? Renders the initial content, ran in 41 milliseconds. So a lot faster than even it would take us to visually verify that those two things are in the document. If we start going and writing our other tests, we can easily see how this would save us a ton of time as our app scales, right? And as each component gets tested. So I do want to do one more test. Just because like this is a pretty simple test. We didn't do any user interaction. We just rendered the component and we checked that stuff exists. So I want to do one test with user interaction as we're starting to come up on being a little longer. Let's just do one test that has user interaction so we can see what it would be like to test our app similar to the way that we didn't interact with it. And then if we were writing, you know, full test coverage for our app, we would go and just write the third test, which would look very similar to the second test. So let's write out our steps one more time, right? So render the component. We don't need to check that this stuff is there because we just checked it in the other test. But what we do want to do is we want to, so for reference, what we're doing is we're clicking on See More, and then we're checking that this content is there. So let's write that exactly in, right? So click on See More button, and then essentially check that the stars content is in the DOM. And then as the last step, we also check that the license is in the DOM, right? So as far as like, so now we've given ourselves kind of these steps to follow, and we can just do exactly like we did in the last test and just fill them in. So I'm just going to copy this guy. I find it actually really helpful to re-render the component per test because it guarantees that we have a blank slate every single test. It guarantees that we're starting with a fresh like system. Yeah, maybe it takes longer, but it takes a matter of like maybe like a millisecond longer per test. So it's a very, very small amount of time to just re-render the component every single unit test. Then like for me, it's very helpful. If you have another philosophy, like all power to you. You're welcome to share that component by multiple tests. You'll just have to make sure that you clean up after your tests run. And then to click on the See More button, only we had a way to click on a button from our test helper library. Something like a function called fire event. Once again, it reads very, very similar to kind of the way that we would actually use it. And the argument to fire event is actually the node that we want to fire the event on. So if we use this get by text helper, essentially what we're saying is I want to fire an event on the button that has the See More content. The exact same way a user would know what this button is for, right? As a user, like I know this is a button maybe because of the outline or whatever, but the way that I know that it shows me more content is because it says See More, right?
Also, get by text returns a node?
Get by text returns a DOM node, yes, that matches, that contains that text, yes. And then we would do the exact same thing that we do up here, right? So I'm just going to copy paste this whole assertion, and then we're just going to change the content, all right? So the stars content was, we said 1,000 stars, right? 1,000. So stars. If we notice in our repo, there is a helper function called add comma. This is not a true unit test where it maybe mocks out things underneath. This is closer to an integration test. If you are just starting out in a code base, sometimes you'll get more bang for your buck. I personally like to lean on the side of integration tests. I find I get more bang for my buck and more value for my time. However, if maybe that add comma did something really wacky under the hood, you might have to mock it out. You might have to do some weird stuff to get it out of your test. However, in this case, if that add comma doesn't add a comma, this test will break, right? If it returns this, or if we expect it to have that, we're going to see it blows up because it's looking for 1,000 without a comma instead of 1,000 with a comma. And that passes, right? And then we could do the exact same thing for our license, right? So, I think we set an MIT license, right? Yep, cool. And let's just take a quick look, and everything passes. The cool thing about testing like this is reading through this test reads very similar to the actual user interaction that we did in our manual testing. And as such, if we decide to refactor the component into multiple components, if we decide to refactor some of the business logic, this is the exact same thing that a QA engineer would do to manually test. The QA engineer, your users, they do not care about whether you refactored the component under the hood, unless it's faster, more bug-free, all of that stuff. What they care about is that when they click that button, they see the extra content. That when the component renders, they see the content. So the cool thing about testing like this is that we are testing only the output of our component, not everything inside and all of the implementation details. As a result, like, these tests end up being very resilient over time, and we can refactor to our heart's desire, and tests really help us do that. They help us to refactor as time goes on, and at least I found that in code base without tests, people tend to kind of tiptoe around the code. They kind of tend to like reach in, flip the one switch that they needed to flip to fix the bug, and then kind of like snake their finger out before they accidentally touch some other code. Whereas if we have a really solid testing suite, we can just refactor without fear of it breaking anything. So that's kind of how we would start testing, at least a code base that has 0 tests. You know, as you come up on more complex components, you might come up on new cases and new things that you need to test. For example, like this test would force us to approach, like, what does it look like to test when content doesn't exist? Or if we were going to go test that search component from before, right, we would be really forced to confront, like, what happens when we hit a network, and how would we mock out a network response with fake data? So as you start getting into testing a untested code base, you'll come up on more complex issues, but I don't think that's a reason for us to not test at all. I think if we start with the simplest components, if we start with the simplest UI, pieces of our UI, and write some automated tests for them, that we can really start to get some security in the code that we ship. And then as time goes on, we also increase our speed in testing and our ability to test faster. And so the problem of where do I start, or, oh, that'll take way too long, just kind of starts to disappear as we start to see its value. So that's all I've got for tonight. Thank you guys very much for coming and listening. I think we'll have time for a couple of questions if you guys want to do that. So thank you. Yeah. If anyone has any, yeah.
Are there any tools in Jest for looking into the elements available and, say, checking for test coverage?
Oh yeah. So Jest as a library ships. It's a wrapper around a lot of other common libraries. So Jest under the hood uses something called Jasmine, which is another popular testing framework, as well as their own assertion library, Sign-On for mocking, and another library called Istanbul, which does code coverage. So actually, to run test coverage, you would just do the same command for test, and you pass a coverage flag, and that should run the test coverage for the repo. In this case, it'll only run against tested files, but you can easily configure it to run against every single file. Oh, there we go. And then you can actually open that. It'll appear in a coverage directory, see, as a HTML file that you can actually open. I actually only know how to do it from the command line. lcov report, index, and it'll actually open your test coverage in the browser.
What is open?
Open is a command line utility that just opens whatever file in whatever the default app for that file is. So if you open an HTML file, the default is your default browser.
Is that a Mac OS thing?
I think it's a Unix thing. It could be a Mac OS thing. I'm not sure. Definitely works on Mac OS. But we could see, as far as the coverage, that we didn't test everything in our repo component, right? We didn't test whether when there isn't a license, it's not available. We didn't test what happens when we close it, because that was our third test case. So coverage is a useful tool for kind of seeing maybe cases that we forgot in our tests. I don't know if it's necessarily a useful tool for like saying we have to be at X amount of coverage. We have to hit 100% coverage. We have to hit whatever. If you're just writing tests in this fashion where you kind of take user stories and turn them into automated tests, it's pretty easy to get close to 80%, 90% without even trying. And then you can use the coverage as a tool to kind of say like, oh yeah, I did forget that case. Let's go test it. So, does that kind of answer?
Yeah.
Sweet. I think you had a question too.
Would you be able to pull up your package.json real quick?
Yeah, of course.
I wanted to look at your dependencies real quick.
So this is React, create React app under the hood. So most of the dependency is going to be create React app. This also holds that splash screen that I had up at the very beginning. So so the router and stuff is for that. But as far as testing goes, these are your core dependencies. Just on, that is to add the to be in the document extra matchers, and you just kind of do that via this extend expect. So just on, and then React testing library are kind of your two big ones. Everything else comes from create React app in this
I wanted
case.
to ask, so Facebook recommends for usage with Jest, and I was surprised that you didn't actually just install the base Jest package. That's what I did before, but don't they recommend to use React Test Editor with Jest?
Those are the default testing utilities that come with React. I found that in many real world apps or bigger apps, people tend to like to use something a little bit more built on top of those. So those are the lowest level utilities for working with React. React Test Renderer, it works. Don't get me wrong. However, it can be a little not ergonomic at times. And so a lot of people will like to build utilities on top of the test renderer. So that's what Enzyme is. It's built on top of React Test Renderer and the React Test Utils. Same thing with React Testing Library. It's just built on top of the renderer. If you want to use the renderer to render your content, by all means, that is another option. I just wanted to show off React Testing Library because I think it's just such a ergonomic API. And I know for myself, I'm about 3 years into my career, and I came upon testing maybe a year and a half ago. And this library has been very helpful for teaching me kind of good ways to test only the output, not the implementation. So
That's cool.
yeah. If you want to dig more into the dependencies, just check out the GitHub repo. I put it in the Discord, and you can poke around the project all you want. Yeah.
So, might be a silly question, but how do you go about and does your testing methodology change when you are mocking services?
Yeah, I think it does, right? And it largely depends on the type of test that you're writing, whether you mock you're thinking mocking a backend service, like a backend API, or mocking a file, or both.
So, probably both.
Yeah.
I feel like the what you test, since you're mocking, I mean, I don't know,
Yeah.
it's confusing, so I just wanted to...
Yeah, totally. And mocking can be, I didn't touch mocking tonight because it's such a in-depth concept that if we started talking about mocking, we'd be here all night. Mocking is something that there's a lot of opinions about, just like with any other test. So I like to lean on the side of mocking less modules internal to my code unless they're extremely side effect heavy. So when I'm writing tests for maybe a front-end app, I'll mock out any code that calls an external API. And a lot of times the easiest way to do that is, for example, in testing that search app, right? So in testing this, would be just the easiest and fastest way would be to mock the entire fetch repos function and just have it return my fake data. If we look at fetch repos, it calls the fetch API, it calls GitHub's API, and then it does all the formatting under the hood. So you could mock out at whatever layer you want, right? You can mock out fetch and have it return a massive JSON blob. It's all up to you and how helpful you feel it is to actually run that code, right? So if you feel it's extremely helpful to run this normalize function for what you're testing at the time. So let's say you're testing that search component. let's say you're testing this and you feel that it is extremely helpful to run that normalized function in this component's test, by all means only mock out the API response and still run that normalized function. Perhaps maybe you're testing that normalized function in a unit test as well, and you don't feel the need to maybe test it in the search components test. You could easily just mock out the whole fetch repos function. I don't know if that sort of answers your question. Like, I feel like the level at which I decide, like, should I mock this or should I not mock this, a lot of times has to do with, will it make my test more unreliable, right? So if I don't mock this out, will I accidentally, like, will daylight savings turn and all my tests break? Or will I be on a train or on a plane or something, and can I still run my tests if I'm on airplane mode? And that's kind of how I try to decide how to mock. Other people like to mock everything. Other people like to mock nothing. So there's a lot of opinions out there.
I feel like when you mock everything, it's like, wait a minute, what's real?
Yeah, at that point you're only testing your mocks. So yeah, I'm not a fan of mocking everything. Just for that exact reason, I feel like the more that you mock, the less your code running in the test environment looks like your code running in the real environment. And so the closest we can get while still feeling that our code is reliable. Like, the reason that you'd mock a third-party API in a unit test is so that, like, you can guarantee that API call always returns the exact same thing, so that you can assert against that content. Versus, if you're in a true end-to-end test, you actually call the API, because if the API is broken, your app is broken.
So, last question.
Yeah.
Do you have a good resource for mocking over?
Yes. A good place to start is the Jest docs. They actually have a lot about mocking. It might be a little in-depth. I don't know if I have a full, like a free resource, like, just off the top of my head. I could try to think of a few, but I know there is the guy who wrote React Testing Library. His name's Kent C. Dodds. He does have a course at a place called testingjavascript.com. It's probably going to take forever to load because I don't know why, but sometimes when I'm in full screen mode, my URL bar doesn't work. Anyways, this is the same guy that wrote React Testing Library. So I'll just drop this link. However, the course is not free. It's a little on the pricier side. It's like $200 or something like that. So
Is it universal though, like in regards to language?
yes. So yeah. As far as, like, these principles go, like, if you write these tests, it doesn't matter what framework you're using. Like, this style of testing, the only thing that will change is whether you're using React Testing Library or some other testing utilities. So this is a great resource. Like, if you want to learn about mocking, I just go read anything he has on mocking. He's a really good resource. He knows a lot of stuff about testing. If you don't feel like shelling out, I think it's like $200 or $300 for the course. If you don't feel like shelling out $300 for his course, like, just go read his articles on his website, and he's got a lot of really good stuff on testing with Jest, how to mock, like, different ways to mock with Jest. So that would be a good resource, I think. Yeah.
How do you decide how isolated to test each component?
Say that one more
How
time.
do you decide how isolated to test each component? Like, for example, in a more full-fledged app, there's a lot of less components. Once you test, for example, the leaf node and then the leaf component, and then its parents, its isolation, or do you find, like, a subtree and test through all of it, or do you cut it off somewhere, or
Yeah.
decide what to test, like?
Yeah. So I think, and this is there's a lot of schools of thought on this as well. The question becomes, like, should I write an integration test or should I lean more on the side of a unit test? I like to test further down the subtree at the layer that has logic. So or just the component itself, right? So if I have one folder that maybe has, like, a ton of little components in it, like, I like to write one test per component, and then I like to write an integration test on my page level. So, like, if I have a whole page of components, but the stuff that you gain by writing these little tests along the way is that when something goes wrong, you actually know what file the problem is in. If you write a test for a massive subtree, your test will break, but you just have to kind of magically know, oh, when it says, when that button click doesn't work, oh yeah, that's in this component, and that's in this file, and then that affects this file. And so if you test kind of like smaller subtrees along the way, and then have this one big test to make sure that they all work together. Because the other problem is if you only test the subtrees and they don't work together, then like your test suite will pass, but your app won't work. So you kind of have to walk a fine line between, and like I don't know how to say like when, like there's no real hard and fast rule. It's something that you have to develop over time. And however, it's not like I said before, having some tests is better than having no tests. And accidentally leaning on one side or another is better than not having any tests. So like saying, oh, whoops, I accidentally tested too deep of a subtree. That test still adds some value to your app. And you can rewrite that test as time goes on, right? You can say, oh, well, this is too brittle for me. Like, let me go break this out into some smaller unit tests, or write some smaller unit tests for those components. Or you say, oh, all my units are working, but I don't know that they work together. Let me go write some integration tests. I think it's better to just get started and write some tests and learn that along the way, because it's something that I think that just comes with writing tests. And cool. Yeah. So I think that's it for tonight. Thank you guys for having me. Thank you for letting me talk about testing. And if you got any more questions, please feel free to come grab me after the talk.